Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to the Center for Strategic International Studies event. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I'm a fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS. I'm very excited to have with me 4 speakers today who will help us unpack China's climate policies, recent developments in the country's energy and climate governance, and implications for the US-China relations and beyond. Before turning to our speakers, let me mention that the past 2 years have been particularly eventful for many reasons, including developments on the climate front. And nowhere has this been more obvious than in China, from China's so-called 30-60 commitments last year, which included reaching greenhouse gas neutrality by 2060, to an energy price hikes globally and shortages in China, to a whole series of high-level documents that have been published or announced in China over the past year. Evaluating the country's progress on the energy transition has been somewhat challenging, although exciting. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from today's guests and learn more about their perspective on this. Today, I'm joined by Alex Wang, professor of law at UCLA School of Law and faculty co-director of the Emmets Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, Byford Tsang, senior policy advisor at the International Climate Change think tank E3G, Michal Meidan, director of the Gas Research Program and director of the China Energy Program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and Michael Davidson, assistant professor joined in the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the University of California, San Diego. So welcome to everyone. Alex, let's start with you. Based on your legal and institutional knowledge of China, what is your view on the country's ability to meet its climate commitments? And what do you think is the role of the US-China relationship in this?
Sure. So thanks, Ilaria, and thanks for having me. I have a lot of respect for what you all do at CSIS, and look forward to this discussion. This question of will China meet its targets is the big one, obviously, that people in China and around the world are wondering. China had a relatively low-key appearance at COP26 with the joint statement with the U.S., really the main piece of new information. There was an interesting article by the senior advisor Wang Yi, who I've had contact with and have a lot of respect for. He had an interview in The Guardian where he makes the point that, well, China's doing a lot more than people recognize, and that, in his view, China's climate policy is misunderstood. And he went on to describe some of what's going on. And I think this is where a lot of our attention will be focused in the coming years. So he mentioned this so-called 1+N policy system that they've developed, right? 1 signifying a main guiding principle document, and N referring to the many subsequent sub-documents that are sub-rules that implement the main document. And he mentioned, the first time I've heard the overall number, he said that there will be 30 documents coming in the next year that break down action in a variety of sectors. And so that's going to keep all of us busy looking at what are the details there and what is our take on this, right? So some of these N documents, and keep in mind, 1+N is not a term unique to the climate context. It's a general. It appears in other policy areas in China, but it signifies this bureaucratic approach with a leading document and sub-documents. So they've already released the 2030 carbon peaking action plan. They've released a number of other documents. All tend to be fairly high level, but they also do cover all the major areas that you would expect a climate policy to cover. And Wang Yi says in his interview that no country has issued so many documents to support its targets. It's a holistic solution and nobody knows, right? And so if you study the Chinese system, you know that the level at which these documents are issued and the number of them is meant to signal a serious commitment and bureaucratic priority, political priority, resolve these sorts of things, and mobilization of the bureaucracy. But you do immediately see a sort of communications problem right there, right? Outside observers are loath to think of, are likely to think of a lot of documents as paper, right? To show me that these things are real and not just paper, a stack of paper. The bureaucrats in China are not the first to show a thick stack of papers as a sign of resolve, right? We see this plenty within the Beltway in DC. But the point is that people want to know more. And so my initial point is that I think I agree with Wang Yi that a lot of people don't recognize exactly how much is going on in China, but China also does need to engage in more transparency and disclosure of more granular information on what they were doing, because it will accrue to their benefit if these policies really are doing what they say that these things are doing. But it's also not just a matter of communications, right? There are a lot of open questions as to the nature of these initiatives. Although it's very clear that these initiatives are broad, comprehensive, and they are, if you speak to anybody on the ground in China, they will refer to an environment where they are feeling pressure to meet these targets, right? And this is something that, I began researching this 15 years ago, and it began in the 11th five-year plan with the energy and pollution targets. And now it's really been a steady sort of expansion of that system of how do you mobilize China's 70 million or however many million party members and bureaucrats to take action for national priorities. But I'll just name a few of the questions that come up, even in just, I took a look back over the one document, the guiding principles document, and immediate questions come up when you read that, right? Which I would love to see if our other panelists have thoughts on. So a big question, of course, immediately is when and how quickly will China move towards absolute emissions reductions, right? So right now there's an intensity-based focus of improving efficiency rather than absolute emissions. But of course, they also have a 2030 peaking target, but everyone's talking about can China move more quickly, and many people believe they can. A second issue that emerges if you read the subtext of the one document is how will China deal with its regional disparities, right? There's a tendency in Chinese policy to allow a little more leeway for the poorer regions and expect a little more from the advanced regions. How does that balance play out in China, right? We've seen more being asked of Beijing, Shanghai, and the Pearl River Delta, but how will the poorer regions be treated? Will they be allowed to sort of go on more or less as business as usual for a longer period of time, or will there be some sort of stricter bottom line assistance given, these types of things? A third question that comes up is, will nationalism hinder Chinese climate action, right? There's an interesting passage in the section about domestic and international action, which reads a little bit combatively, which is perfectly, it's not unexpected in a document like this, but it talks about, in the international response to climate change, we, China, need to be prepared to both stand our ground and engage in cooperation and resolutely safeguard our development rights and interests. That comes across as, look, we will not let others tell us what to do. And we've also seen the way that nationalist dynamics can play against environmental action within China. And then just two other points I'll mention very quickly is the big question, obviously, how will China balance climate goals against other goals, right? This is something that every country is dealing with, but they're very explicit about it in the one document, talking about balancing environmental action against security, energy security, industrial security, supply chain security, food security. And we're already, and some of our other speakers will speak to the energy dynamics this year. And then so finally, this all amounts to a question of, to what extent will action on the ground be merely symbolic or genuine, right? This is always the question in regulatory action. And as someone who's been involved in this scene, I know that there's a lot of substance going on, but there's also a sort of, a lot been written about the way that, the message needs to be that targets are being met. And so there is an interaction between center and local that doesn't always play in favor of actual substantive action and can sometimes lean on symbolism. And so those are some of the issues that I'll use to frame. And then just a very quick word on U.S.-China action. There's been a lot of discussion about this year, and I'm of the camp that somewhat too much attention has been focused on the cooperation side of things, although I'm perfectly supportive and engage in a lot of cooperation. But just a recognition that I believe that competition that is managed in a constructive way will lead to more innovation, faster action, and these sorts of things. And that's just, we understand that's true in business. We understand that that's true in scientific research. And so why wouldn't that be the case in the area of climate action? And I think there are lots of opportunities for constructive competition. So with that as introduction, I'll stop there and look forward to hearing whatever everyone else has to say.
Well, thank you. That's excellent introduction to the issue, and also many questions for us to think about and hopefully address throughout this conversation. I would like to move on to Byford, who has been following closely COP26 and also China's engagement with the EU on climate issues. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, and thinking about the role of also climate diplomacy and China's engagement with other countries. How does this play into China's ability to meet its climate targets and the developments we've seen domestically in China?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thanks, Ilaria, for having me on the panel. So looking forward to the discussion. So I think to answer that question, I think my starting point is, I think we should all recognize that it's in China's own interest to move on climate change and to achieve its climate goals, because China is also, as well, Europe is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So, and it's having an impact on people's livelihood and causing disruptions in supply chain. Floods last year in central China has sent food prices rising. Floods in northern China this year has sent coal prices rising. And also over the summer, there was one of the central provinces in China actually has one of the worst flooding in years. So I think that's a reminder of China is still extremely vulnerable to climate change, and it is in its own interest to act on it. And also, we also have to realize that China is doubling down on its renewable and low carbon sector as one of the key drivers of economic development in its long-term strategy, including its latest 5-year plan that was published in March, but also its longer-term Made in China 2025 strategies, where we see solar electric vehicles and batteries are featured prominently in these long-term strategies. And China now manufactures about 3/4 of the world's solar panels and over 3/4 of the world's lithium battery cells, which power a lot of electric vehicles. So I guess the question for me is not whether China will move, but if China is moving fast enough, and whether China's international commitments is necessary to keep the world on a safe climate trajectory. And if not, is diplomacy a useful tool to get China to move? So I think the answer to the first question with regards to whether China is moving fast enough, I think the answer at the moment is no. For China to keep the temperature goals that we have agreed at in the Paris Agreement within reach, China would need to peak its emissions as soon as possible, preferably before middle of this decade, and also to stop building new coal-fired power stations as soon as possible. So, and to put that in context, China now accounts for 27% of the global emissions, and over half of the world's coal power pipeline is located in China. So it's absolutely critical that China move faster. So, and then the second question is whether diplomacy has played a role or can play a role. So if we look back at the past year or so ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, so at Glasgow, a lot of the focus was on China watering down the language on coal in the final Glasgow statement. But we also have to realize that China has actually signed on to, as the part of the Glasgow Pact, the final text that came out from the conference, that is going to revisit its climate targets, well, alongside with all other countries, revisit the 2030 climate targets and strengthen them if necessary, if they're not meeting the kind of requirements set out by the Paris Agreement, for example. And they have also, before COP, pledged to not to support construction of coal power plants overseas. So China has actually moved in some respects this year. And while it's very hard to directly link that to diplomacy, but we did see that at the G7 with the Italian G20 presidency, the US climate envoy, the COP president, and the EU president have again and again, ahead of COP, have engaged China on what it needs to do, which include the things that I've just said, including peaking emissions and ending coal-fired power plants, and also keeping coal as an issue on the agenda. So we saw that coal, or the ending of international coal finance as an issue that was brought up at G7 and the G20 at the main stage and in the final statement for the first time. So it's definitely that kind of diplomatic pressure, I would say, did contribute to China's movement. But also we also have to look in terms of China, in terms of the countries around China's neighborhoods. So China's commitment on coal actually came after similar commitments from South Korea and Japan, and they too are also the major financier of coal internationally. And China, with them moving on international coal finance, China was the last remaining provider of international coal finance. So China's position has been made quite untenable after those countries have moved, and also more untenable as some of the recipients of Chinese coal finance, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Pakistan, they have all, one way or another in this year, say that coal will be phased down as part of their power system. So, so we do see that diplomacy has a role to play because China does recognize itself as an international leader on climate change, and it also wants to be seen as a positive contributor to the international climate governance. And I'll just end on a final point on diplomacy. So while the focus during COP and also throughout the year on climate diplomacy was about moving China on coal, but we did see that a lot of the developing countries and vulnerable countries, well, countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as the small island nation states, who negotiated alongside China as a bloc within the UN climate negotiations. Well, they were not happy with the watered down of the core language in the Glasgow text, but the disappointment from them actually directed more towards the underwhelming performance from the developed countries in providing more financial support to support them to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So I think we also have to think about, in order to kind of move China on their climate policies, developed countries will also have to respond to the increasing demand from developing countries and climate vulnerable countries who are negotiating alongside China in the UN climate processes, respond to their needs on increased financial needs to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because that would help build trust from these countries and also build momentum for greater climate ambition on coal and on climate by major emitters, including China. So I'll end there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, very interesting. So perhaps more tangible action is required from developed countries as well, is what I'm hearing here, and not just discussions over words, basically. Yeah. Well, now I'm happy to welcome Michal. I think I have many questions. You recently published a really interesting report on the implication of China's governance system and the institutions for meeting its climate commitments. And I'm wondering how you think this will play out, and also what the outlook is for the fossil fuel industries, which obviously represents still the majority of China's energy mix.
Thanks, Ilaria. As my predecessors, sort of first of all, a thank you for inviting me to this fantastic panel, and I too look forward to the discussion. As you mentioned, sort of in our recent paper, we look at the institutions, the government, and sort of how they both help and hinder the transition. And, you know, when my co-authors and I, Anders Hovey, Philip Andrew Speed, started working on this almost a year ago, it was just after the 30/60 pledge. And it was really informed by two main questions that we were getting in both corporate and government circles. The first is China actually committed to these goals? And second, you know, can it achieve them? I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that the task is formidable. Of course, going from an energy system that relies on fossil fuels for 80% right now to a system that relies on non-fossil fuels for 80%. Not just the technicalities of building enough renewables, but of course the implications for China's political economy, right? I mean, if you put it very simply, China's growth model has relied on manufacturing and industry, developing the infrastructure associated with it, and that's all gone through state-owned companies in heavy industries and state-owned banking system, and that whole system now needs to change, right? And if we put it again quite crudely, the energy transition often suggests that fossil fuels, heavy industry need to lose, or they are the losers. But in China, the state can't lose. And so, I think for the first question, is China committed? I think the answer is clearly yes, and for a number of reasons. And I think Byford really laid them out very coherently and eloquently just now. The second question about can China achieve this, I think is interesting, and sort of the angle that we took was sort of to address the implicit question, or the kind of this binary view that we often tend to have, that on one hand, the political and economic importance of state-owned incumbents, and again, the fossil fuel industry and coal that is very reliable, combined with sort of limited market mechanisms, the legal system, will hinder the transition. The flip side of that argument is that China has a centralized system that is able to mobilize resources, guide technological development, innovation to a certain degree, and so is hugely capable of driving change. And so sort of which one is it? And I think the reality is that both are true. Now, of course, that might seem like a little bit of a cop-out. Yes, it both helps and hinders. But what we also wanted to do was think about a preliminary framework that will help us to think where China is more likely to deliver on change and where it is more likely to struggle. And so in the paper, what we basically argue is that China has historically been better at building energy supplies and adding what we've called the kind of hardware of energy infrastructure. It's found it harder to adjust to, again, what we've called the software of institutional, societal change. And if you sort of pull the thread on that and think about it going forward, China is likely to continue to expand the hardware, right? It's got strong institutions that are devoted to investing in supply, but it's more likely to struggle with the software because this relies on a demand pull. It relies on market incentives to a greater degree, greater coordination among stakeholders and between sectors. And I mean, this doesn't mean that China cannot and will not achieve the transition. I do think that the commitment is strong, mainly because the drivers are multifaceted, right? It's the industrial element, it's the food security, it is some of the international image and reputation. But I do think it suggests that some parts will move faster than others, and the transition may not be achieved in perhaps an economically efficient manner. And I think sort of a similar argument applies when we think about technology and innovation. China's institutional structures have really enabled innovation, and these are obviously things that you've worked a lot on in first generation technologies. But there are real questions, I think, around the role of China's incumbent industries and to what extent they will slow the kind of transformational change that is required, especially for kind of more modular technologies that are less capital intensive. They require greater sort of societal involvement and coordination. So China has come to dominate global supplies in manufacturing intensive technologies, right? If we think about solar photovoltaics and batteries, really thanks to China helping to scale up these technologies, we have seen huge cost declines that have advanced the energy transition globally. In design-intensive technologies, however, such as wind, cost declines have not been as significant. And I think sort of when we look forward, and that's the argument that we make, we see less transformative progress in technologies that are sort of less modular and more design-intensive, and where state-owned enterprises may play a larger role. To echo some of Alex's comments, I think the speed and scope of change, I think, will depend on international collaboration. I do think that while constructive competition can help accelerate efforts, if we see these efforts to recreate supply chains or to fragment, or, I think decoupling is a big word, but efforts to kind of decouple and recreate supply chains could actually slow the pace of change when we just don't have time. And maybe one last point to note, and to bring it sort of back to this year, I think it's been really a year of mixed signals in China, with kind of the strong commitment to 3060. And I think a lot of initial efforts, as well as Alex laid out, the kind of 1+N, and to really to get the wheels of change in motion and to start driving the whole system in a different direction. On the other hand, we've seen strong economic growth, the importance of reliability and stability, which again reinforces the hands of incumbents and perhaps of existing policy trajectories. I think these tensions are unlikely to disappear, and if anything, they will deepen as the transition, its impacts, and the costs associated with it will become clear. And again, here, I think we will sort of full circle back. We will have to go back to the importance of institutions and governance and work with China on the areas where it can deliver strong change, but equally where I think there is impetus for change that will be needed perhaps from the outside, from international collaboration, from sharing best practices sort of on the software, and hope that the world will be open to such collaboration.
Thank you. Very interesting. I hope we'll be able to talk a little more about these challenges. I think there's a rich conversation to be had on the framework of competition versus cooperation. My own view is that perhaps some areas are cooperation is appropriate, in some areas competition is appropriate, right? It might not be quite such a dualistic framework as we may sometimes think about it. I would also encourage those watching from home to use the Q&A function, because we will be taking questions from the public in just a few minutes. But before that, I would like to move on to Michal Davidson, who is our power sector expert here. And so just getting even further into the weeds, but also talking about one of the most important elements in China's energy transition. I wanted to ask you what your perspective is, looking, as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about China's power sector, and also given what we've seen this year when we all became power sector experts for a few months. The shortages were obviously quite shocking for within the Chinese system and had political repercussions. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on how this affects China's ability to meet its climate commitments.
Yeah, thanks, Ilaria, and thanks for organizing this session. I think it's really timely, and I'm really delighted to be able to share the stage with these other great experts on China. So the power shortages is really interesting event that happened, and I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago. Michal also wrote a brief on this, which is excellent. And so I think there's infrastructural issues. We saw demand kind of growing unexpectedly, and coal supply elasticity was also constrained, so that the market was getting a little tight. We also had some really clear institutional issues in the fact that the electricity institutions and the coal institutions have been liberalized at an uneven pace. And so essentially when coal prices rise, coal plants operators can't pass through that increased fuel price cost to their consumers, so they become unwilling to generate. Now there's been a third kind of element of this, which has been percolating around various news reports, that renewable energy availability was a key cause of the concern. So wind wasn't there when you needed it, solar, etc. This is not a leading cause in China's case. I think this is mostly a red herring. We did notice a small reduction in hydropower, but that was also fairly predictable. So I think what we're looking at here is that these are all largely predictable drivers. We knew there was going to be a post-COVID resurgence demand. There was lots of coal supply elasticity warnings. But there's really deep-seated flaws in China's institutional structure, which Michal also hinted at, which are really driving a lot of these, and they're kind of, intersecting with the climate ambitions of China in a really interesting way. And so the central government, to respond to these power shortages, intervened in a couple of areas. One is it forced open the coal mines, said you need to produce a lot more coal in order to meet the upcoming winter heating season. So that led to increases in coal and a lot of calls that China was backtracking on its long-term climate commitments. It also relaxed some of the electricity market restrictions, so it allowed prices to rise more, and that alleviated some of the burdens on coal plants. And it also made a series of statements about how central coal is to the economy in the most recent economic meeting, which also gave some people pause. Oh, China, on one hand is committing to peaking, but it's also saying, oh, coal is a central part of the economy. How can that be? And I think the bottom line is that the short-term responses to this crisis should not really be mistaken for changes in long-term trends and ambition. We do see there's a key conflict here, and I think there's a lot of work that China needs to do in the next 10 years. We're just thinking about the 14 five-year plan and the 15 five-year plan in order to get on track towards a carbon neutrality pathway. And I think there's some assumptions and scenarios out there that China's going to kind of go little bit of BAU, and it will kind of gradually peak, and then in 2031 dramatically it's going to start reducing emissions. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? So really there needs to be a lot more thinking on that near-term structure. And so if we think about kind of second point I want to make is the structural challenges that China faces towards meeting carbon neutrality are immense. This is a very ambitious target. And I can't stress enough how underappreciated it is that when Xi Jinping made this announcement in September 2020, how much it really changed the discussion within China and is changing incentives throughout the bureaucratic structure towards low carbon pathways. So the first, and I'll just highlight a couple of key challenges here. The first challenge is low carbon energy build out and grid integration. So I'm doing some research with Tsinghua University, and we're looking at how much wind and solar would China need to build in order to achieve its 2060 net zero target. It's enormous. 2 to 3 terawatts each of wind and solar is kind of our rough ballpark. You compare that to about 280 gigawatts of wind, 250 gigawatts of solar at the end of 2020. So you're talking about order of magnitude more that you need to build by 2060. And that's also not including all of the difficult challenges you're going to face with land use constraints, trying to keep curtailment low as you integrate high shares of variable renewable energy. You have to think about how you're going to manage the variability and the flexibility of the system. So you need to build a lot more storage. We mentioned batteries. You might need a terawatt of batteries. I don't think anyone's talking about terawatt scale batteries anywhere else, but you might need a terawatt of batteries in China to accommodate this, and lots more transmission. So I think there's infrastructural kind of low carbon energy build up, and there's institutional challenges as well. And so Alex noted these targets and bureaucratic incentives, which China has relied upon extensively in the energy and environmental domain. Those are going to continue. But I think what we're going to see going forward is there's going to be increasing need for markets, not as a showy sign of, yes, China's liberalizing, but as a necessary means of cost control. Because you're going to deploy a lot of these things. If you do it very inefficiently, the state's going to be very quickly taxed. So, and there are many conflicts and sectoral reform challenges here. So I thought I might also just mention briefly, 3 areas where you might accelerate China's efforts in the near term, because we're really focusing on that 5 to 10 year window. And I think we should recognize first off that China tends to underpromise and overdeliver when it comes to climate commitments. So as Byford noted, China may come back to COP27 with an enhanced commitment. That certainly could happen. There's also a lot of domestic changes that we need to watch to basically, ensure that China over delivers on whatever commitment it brings to the international climate area. And I think there's kind of 3 areas there. One is state-owned enterprises, which Michal mentioned as being key to this transition. They have some very ambitious 2025 targets, so very near-term low carbon development that they have no idea how they're going to build out that much solar. They're all making net zero transition plans. And I think it's really interesting to watch, for example, Huaneng and China Energy. Each of these companies has the comparable emissions to Germany, right? So, think about how massive the scale is for how they can, through their energy sector investment decisions and dealing with their own fossil worker placement, retraining problems, they can kind of address this challenge. Second is local governments. They're rushing into carbon neutrality. They're key to economic and energy planning and key to whether or not you drive a lot of energy intensive infrastructure investment as we come out of COVID or go more low carbon. And the third is power sector reforms, kind of near and dear to my heart. Power sector markets account for 40% of electricity sold in China now. This is a dramatic shift from pre-2015 when the recent reform document came out. So a lot of efforts have been made, but these have been largely long-term markets, which are geared towards coal. They don't really help low carbon, and in fact, in some cases, they may hurt low carbon sources. So the question, the challenges for power market reforms going forward is, how do you allow more efficient prices to go through that can help with energy security? How do you maintain incentives for renewables by addressing, how this shift away from a feed-in tariff is going to impact development? And how do you create kind of true incentives for flexibility in thermal power so that coal plants make more money as they generate less and become more flexible and help the low carbon transition? So I'll stop there, but I'm really interested to hear more about the questions that folks have in the discussion.
Yes, so we do already have some interesting questions, but before we even get to that, I do have something that follows up on what many of you have just discussed, and that is, my personal assessment is that when when the question comes up of whether China or not is committed to its climate commitments, my sense is that actually, when you look at what might be competing goals and you look at economic strategies, they're broadly consistent with China's decarbonization plans. There may be some issues, but there's generally speaking, there's a lot of positive reinforcement in some areas. But the issue remains of whether even these economic strategies are, can be achieved. And we know that there's still a lot of issues that remain unaddressed in China's implementation capacity, and the institutional structure, as you mentioned, is not always entirely consistent with getting these. With achieving its climate goals, when and as Alex mentioned, and sometimes we don't even know what the details are. So I think my question to you all is it doable in the sense that, what can China actually achieve in the short term, given the institutional challenges that remain in place, and what perhaps what are the reforms that need to happen, and what can happen despite the challenges and the governance structure that is currently in place. So I don't know who wants to start. I can call on you, but if somebody wants to volunteer, that's easier.
I can just chime in with some thoughts. I mean, one area that I'm very curious as to whether China could move much more aggressively is just electrification and moving towards renewables in the electricity sector. So I would love to have some discussion with the others on this, right? And Michael and I have had some discussions, for example, about the national ETS, the emissions trading system, and had some debates about what we think about it. My own view of it is, I was disappointed in its relative modesty, right? It's set up as largely a system to improve efficiency, and the creators that are very frank that it's an effort to create a sort of modest tax for less efficient plants and a subsidy for more efficient plants. And sort of my hope had been, just because there are wind and solar and other renewable technologies, that China would just move much more aggressively to shift away from coal in that area, because at least you have technological feasibility. Of course, you have political barriers of what do you do with coal and these sorts of things. But there seemed like, among industries, that seemed like an area where you could really move more aggressively forward. So that's an area that I'll be monitoring very closely in just the coming years. The one positive thing is, for example, on the ETS, there was a lot of discussion about it at the launch earlier this year. And as I've been tracking it, there is, on the positive side, they are already proposing very sort of regular reforms to it, right? So this coming year, they are looking to sell more allowances, whereas now they give them away for free, right? So the impact on the firms is less now, and there will be more cost next year. They're talking about expanding it to other industries. They're talking about tightening the efficiency benchmarks, those sorts of things. And so even if something starts out weak, that's an area where there's mixed signals, right? You see them actually pushing to be a little bit stronger, but it still feels a little bit weaker than it could be to me.
I mean, I'm happy to follow up on that. Just to sort of say, I think for the ETS as well, it has been a slow start. The key is, right, it's discovery, right? The first stage is to even understand what are the emission profiles. And I think that is one of the most important steps that China has to take now, is improving data, improving transparency domestically, hopefully internationally. Unfortunately, it feels like the trend is going in the opposite direction of sharing less data. But really, I think even for decision makers, there is this need to get a grip of what is actually happening. And feels like 2021 was a lot about closing a lot of the regulatory data and information loopholes. I think that needs to continue. In terms of the economic strategies, and that's where I am hopeful that the 30/60 pledges are real, because I think I agree with you, Ilaria, it goes hand in hand with economic rebalancing, with rising up the industrial value chain and remaining not just credible, but central to global supply chains. If the Chinese industry is not fit for purpose in the context of a global carbon budget, it will be, it will lose its competitiveness. But there is, and I think we look a lot at the supply side of things. I think demand side management is where there is huge potential, energy efficiencies. China does not need to grow and use the same kind of growth model that the West has. It doesn't need big urban sprawls that require cars. Actually, there's public transportation that can be developed. There's a huge amount of work that can be done on energy efficiencies that I think could enable this growth, sort of a sustainable growth trajectory that doesn't, as Michael was saying, doesn't start sort of post 2030 when all of a sudden stuff has to happen. It can start now.
I might jump in with a couple thoughts here as well.
Go ahead.
Alex and I and others have talked about carbon markets. I think the role of carbon markets is pretty muted in the near term. I don't expect it to play a significant role in either decreasing or increasing China's ambition by 2030, but it can serve a very important role in the long run. One thing, if we look at what are near-term possibilities, I think the power sector, there's lots of areas where you can make some changes, specifically because China has been experimenting with this for already 6 years with the 2015 reforms. And one area that I think has a lot of promise is getting in place really strong incentives for flexibility. And this may seem relatively minor, but in fact, it is the key to revenue projections for state-owned enterprises that are thinking about transitioning their coal assets. If you create a pathway for them to make more money for their coal plants, even as they're generating less and producing less coal, they're going to not be so obstructionist. And this is a key difference between China and other countries. China's energy state-owned enterprises are heavily diversified. It's not a giant coal utility that's just going to categorically lose. They can really diversify in these other areas. And there's been experiments underway. And I'll just mention one example, which is the minimum generating output of coal plants. It is the key reason why you have high curtailment rates, because coal plants can't ramp down low enough in order to accommodate renewables. When I first went to a Chinese coal plant a decade ago, they said 60%. We can't go lower than 60% of our output without doing a very costly shutdown. Then curtailment rose. They reduced that to 40% across most of the country in response to a lot of pressure from Beijing. But you can go even lower than that. Coal plants in Europe go much lower than that when necessary, and some parts of China do. You can go down to 15%. This is a key, and you need to create the incentives to get those coal plants to get online with that. And that can really provide that glide path. It can really generate a strong, robust momentum for these companies to really engage in a lot more low carbon energy while still feeling like their coal assets have a little bit more runway.
Byford, did you have any thoughts on that? Otherwise, I do have a question that I think you may want to address. We have one question that asks, what are the examples of current and potentially future constructive competition on clean energy? Do we actually don't need clear standards on clean energy tech, which perhaps may require more cooperation? One example that is provided is green lithium standards, for example.
So I think, on that, I think, that's definitely an area where competition and cooperation will happen hand in hand. So on the cooperation side of things, like you said, on standards, so the EU is actually coming up with a number of standards that speaks to this question. So the EU is now proposing a general kind of due diligence legislation, which is going to require all companies that have an operation in Europe to have a responsibility to report environmental and social conditions of their supply chain. So that in itself would cover that. And the EU has also specifically going to target the battery sector as well with a proposed battery standard, which should come into play in the next 2 years or so, which would have requirements for the carbon emissions from the productions of batteries. So but then again, I was saying the EU, so these are like unilateral domestic policies which would have international implications. So I think like what Michelle have mentioned in terms of we don't want to create fragmented and fractured supply chains, because the world doesn't have the time for slowing down adoption for these technology. But I think at the same time, we will have to kind of square that with the political reality of how people and consumers are now more conscious about the environmental credentials of their technology. Politicians are more concerned about dependency on China and on any single country, for example, because of COVID, because of political reasons. So I think we will have to square those political consumer preferences with the need to transition, and that will require cooperation. So the EU would need to, even if it's the domestic regulation, as I just discussed, like the EU would need to talk to its trading partners about these preemptively very early on to prevent a situation where there will be trade sanctions or a trade war being put in place, like what we had about a decade ago with the solar panel tariff trade war that happened between China and the EU, for example.
So perhaps it's more of a coercive cooperation or a cooperative coercion of sorts that promotes some competition. So it's much more complicated is what I'm hearing here. And it's interesting, the thought of using domestic regulation to actually incentivize other countries to take more by using it, the power of the size of one's market, right? I have another interesting question, which may perhaps that I think is worth thinking about. So Xiahua says that the IEA's annual coal report is going to come out tomorrow, and they note an increase of coal use in 2021, and think the numbers will increase even further in 2022, mainly driven by China, with an assist from India. So how do you think these numbers square with the COP26 agreement to phase down coal? And I think this really goes back to the issue of short-term versus long-term action and goals in China. Again, if anybody wants to volunteer, I'll call.
I'll jump in, I guess, with a first take, since I mentioned this. I think we shouldn't be mistaking the near-term responses to a crisis for long-term changes in ambition. I think that's the first takeaway. We expected coal use to rise, certainly relative to 2020 because of pandemic. It certainly demand surprised a number of folks, though we saw some early indications even in the spring that demand was rising very rapidly in China. I think this is going to be a really key question in both Delhi and Beijing, which is energy security. How central is coal to energy security? I think that non-fossil energies, in fact, provide a lot more robustness and security to the national energy situations in both of these countries, particularly if we look at where the fossil fuel crises have originated this year. But that's a difficult sell because renewable energy has always been pegged as being unreliable. So there's going to have to be some more discussions, some more, I think, technical discussions, as well as honest assessments of where renewable energy performed quite well in both of these countries, and where coal is perhaps much more fragile than they once thought.
Well, I'll move on to another question if no one else wants to chime into that. But there's several questions here, so I'm going to try and summarize a little bit. But we do have a question on how, beyond the power sector, and I think we did mention the SOEs, but what about manufacturing sectors and the hard to abate sectors? How does the energy transition, decarbonization look there? And I think tied to this, there's another question about basically who are the foot draggers in the decarbonization and the energy transition in China. So who might be the political, the ones who might challenge or make it harder?
Happy to take a stab at that. Look, I think there's a certain element of just structural economic change, right? When China sort of urbanization peaks and we hit the kind of post-industrial part of it, again, that's the economic rebalancing agenda, and that helps. But of course, we want to avoid China building out more, sort of as much as possible now, and peaking emissions at a higher level, and then starting to ramp that down and actually doing kind of the rest of the growth that is to be done in the urbanization, industrialization in the most efficient manner possible. And again, I think that's where dialogue with other parties, with the EU, with the US on hydrogen, on sort of innovation in the hard to abate sectors has to come in. We all know that those are kind of the potential solutions. They need to be explored and tested and tried both on a technical level, a cost level. We need to understand whether, hydrogen actually is the silver bullet that everybody thinks it is. Is it environment, what is its carbon footprint, its environmental and energy use footprint, before we just assume that it is the answer. But in that respect, perhaps it goes back to the question of competition. The more trials, and the more examples of hydrogen as one potential solution we have, perhaps the better, because it will enable us to see what happens. I mean, the foot draggers, I think there was a very interesting comment by Michael when he said that the state-owned enterprises are more diverse, or sort of have more diverse economic activities than we realize, and that they are able to change. Because, when you think about it very simplistically, some of the provinces and the poorer provinces that were alluded to earlier, those are the potential foot draggers, the incumbents that stand to lose. And this is where it might be just a change of mindset that we can create. I think this year, sort of in the post-COVID pandemic, in the post-COVID recovery in 2022 is going to be all about stability. And we might see these trade-offs between kind of growth, stability, sustainability, where sort of action and change towards the climate targets will will put those priorities at odds. But I think moving beyond that, there is scope for the economic trajectory, innovation, to become sort of mutually reinforcing, I think, as you said earlier, Ilaria, and to have, again, growth and sustainability go hand in hand and be solutions for these kind of potentially losing industries or incumbents that stand to lose. These will actually be positive solutions and situations.
Yeah, if I could chime in on that. I mean, I think who are the opponents to this is probably a sort of familiar to those of us who look at this, right? A lot of the old line industries, a lot of the regions that depend on those old line industries. I think the interesting thing we need to know more about is exactly who are the parties that are beginning to gain from the transition, right? And so in that light, I think Michael's comment about the SOEs is really an important area for future research that I don't think we understand well enough. And I think there'll be a lot of variation among different companies, but understanding how an SOE might view the transition as an opportunity rather than as a cost, that a lot will turn on that, right? And there's been work, for example, in California on obviously we have a particular voting public in California, but also there are kind of industrial, the companies that essentially stand to benefit a lot from the direction, in renewable energy and elsewhere. And so that is part of the story as well. So to what extent can you make as many SOEs as possible see this as an opportunity to shift them towards a situation where they just don't mind the transition so much? Industry will be hard because just of the technological dynamic. We don't know exactly how to really make that low carbon. That's been tough in California, right? So we've made a lot more progress on electricity sector and transportation, but much less so on industry, because people are worried about economic impacts on the industries, and the technologies, economically viable technologies are not quite there yet. So, in China, I think industry will be tough, but as with transportation and electricity, it would be great to see China moving much more quickly than it is.
Great. I mean, I think this is a very complex question, and I agree that more research would be beneficial, actually, to understand, not just in China, probably globally, right? But there is another question on actors, and I think perhaps Byford, but also maybe Alex, everybody is welcome to answer, but on the role of NGOs, which used to be very active players and have been a little more muted recently. So what do you think the situation is, and moving forward, what can we expect?
Yeah, so I think I wouldn't characterize it as more muted. these days, but obviously compared to the pre-2017 introduction of the NGO law, there's a marked difference. But I would say that these days, a lot of the NGOs are still working quite hard to advocate for the agenda. But I think we did hear from some of our partners in China this year saying that obviously the tensions with Europe and with the US has had an impact on their work, especially the kind of changing narrative regarding climate. I mean, obviously, the 30-60 target by President Xi and also the big announcement, they do play into a lot of the conversation, but there's also, because of the growing tensions, that people who are not part of the climate conversation, they tend to seize on narrative about energy security, whether climate change is a plot for the West to constrain China's development. I mean, these are the debates that were settled a long time ago in China, but we do see them emerge these days, and we have heard from some of our Chinese partners that some of these narratives are being seized upon by the incumbents in the sector to advance for their cause, for example. So I think in that sense, that is having an impact on the climate discussions in China. But I'm sure Alex would have more to say on this topic.
Oh, I mean, in the last few years, I haven't worked as closely with the NGOs. I used to spend a lot of time with the Chinese NGOs when I was with NRDC. But I think the direction in China has obviously been much more government focused, and there's been more pressure on NGOs, and NGOs that are in the field seem to be, they believe their space is to play a supportive role of pushing along things that are state policy, and I think playing that traditional kind of nudging role behind the scenes that they've always played. I hope that there can be more space for NGOs and for academics and for the press, frankly, on the typical accountability role that those sectors play in other countries, right? China is, there's obviously a spectrum of this in different countries, and China is on the much tighter end of control of those things. And there are obvious ways that could go badly, right? If there are cities or places that are not implementing well, or implementing in a way that is only symbolic and not, it'll be harder to discover that as quickly if there's fewer accountability mechanisms. So obviously, I'm a strong believer in those types of accountability mechanisms, and I know there are supporters of that in China, and I hope that we can shift the pendulum back in the direction of a little more action from the NGOs.
Great, thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, so I just wanted to ask if anybody had concluding thoughts on, moving forward, right? Next year is probably going to be really crucial in actually understanding what the direction is for China's climate policy, and also, in terms of expectations for perhaps some more ambitious goals at COP27. So where are you going to be focusing? What are you going to be focusing on? Are there some specific areas that for you will really show and indicate whether or not this is doable, and whether you'll see more ambition, and what is the direction? What are you looking out for next year?
I mean, I think next year is crucial. We're going to have all the paperwork come out, 14th five-year plan, end plans. I don't know to what extent we should sort of fixate on them as the kind of signpost, because there will be many of them, and for all the reasons we discussed, right? The need for provinces to fit in with them, to overperform, they might be vague. I think we're also going to see the need for stability, right, in the run up to the party congress. So I think it is going to be yet another year of very mixed signals. What I think we can look out for is exactly how many coal-fired power plants get built. The lower, actually, the number, the better. I think US, China, and to what extent, and to kind of think about it very concretely, methane. Is there a methane action plan? Is there any sort of a concrete meeting? And again, efforts on standards, information, data will be critical. And just sort of on oil and gas, which is something that I look at quite a lot. If we do start to get refining closures, in addition to sort of new additions, but actually refineries starting to shut down, I think that would also be a very important signpost.
So I think, yeah, I'm sitting more on the pessimistic side about regarding the kind of bilateral relations between EU, China, and US, China. I think they will remain tense. But I think the question for us, like people in think tank, civil society, academics, is to think about how we manage that tension. Like what I said about new supply chain instruments from European Union or a carbon border adjustment tax. So how do we make these tools useful for, well, not just the transition in Europe or in the US, but also like in China, but also globally, so that we're not in a situation where we win the argument, but then we lose the overall progress in the transition.
So for me, I feel like in the near term, I really want to see some much stronger action on the electricity sector. You know, this is not I'm not an electricity sector guy primarily, focus more on environmental regulation and pollution. But at the core of climate policy, you need to electrify a lot of things, and you need to get carbon out of the electricity sector. And there's more sort of technology available for this, and a lot of ideas on how to do this as a matter of policy and institutional design. So faster action on that. We understand the reasons why it's slow now, but you know, China needs to use its much vaunted top-down system to break through those barriers in the near term.
Michael?
Great, yeah. So next year, what am I watching? So I'm watching SOE carbon neutrality plans. I think that's going to be a key indicator of how ambitious they are and how much detail they have, how much legwork they've done to think about that. Second is electricity sector reforms. Power shortages prompted a kind of knee-jerk reaction to open up the markets a little bit more. Is it going to stay open? Are they going to open it further? There's been also calls to essentially re-regulate coal prices to remove the liberalization or to deliberalize. I'm not sure if that's a word. That would be a key indication of going in the wrong direction. And then thirdly, I think geopolitics. Byford mentioned this. It certainly doesn't seem to be improving dramatically, even though, you know, there seem to be some positive elements coming out of the Biden-Xi phone call. I think the key aspect here is both sides seem to want climate to be an area of cooperation, but they're not quite convinced at how broad of an area does that encompass. And I really think we need to get serious about the effect that supply chain tensions and conflicts and the technology tensions and conflicts and the academic and research tensions and conflicts are going to hurt our long-term goals. And so I'd love to see more frank discussion about that on both sides and how we're going to achieve our climate goals.
Well, thank you, everyone. I thought this was a really interesting discussion. I hope we'll be able to follow up with all of you and have future discussions on these topics. We're already gone over time, so I think we'll leave it at that. I believe there were some people in the public asking if this will be recorded. I mean, it is recorded and it will be posted on our website, on the CSIS website. So if you need to revisit it, it will be there. And I encourage everyone to follow our program, the Chinese Business and Economics Twitter account, and look out for future programs, events, and publications. Thank you, everyone, and we'll have a good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye.